Thank you very much. I'm going to talk to you today about the American South, a subject that's close to my heart. I've worked in for many years, and I'm going to take you on a journey with me using photographs that I've made of these places, its people, the worlds along the way. The American South has been compared to a Sphinx that rarely, if ever, fully reveals her secrets. William Faulkner once remarked that in the South, the past is never dead. It's not even past. Faulkner has a novel, Absalom Absalom, in which a character named Quentin Compson has just arrived as a freshman at Harvard from Mississippi, and he meets his Canadian roommate, Shreve, who is curious about the South. Shreve asks Quentin, "Tell about the South. What's it like there? What do they do there? Why do they live there? Why do they live at all?" I love to tell my students an African proverb that says, when an old woman or man dies, a library burns to the ground. And it's in that sense of urgency that folklorists try to preserve the stories, the places, the memory of the South. My grandfather once told me that he had been raised on cornbread and recollections. And my father would sometimes tell me that you can always learn a lesson from each person you meet in life. And as a folklorist, I've tried to follow that. Southerners love places. They love the sense of place. And when a Southerner meets a stranger, the first question always is, "Where are you from?" "Oh, you're from New Orleans? You're from Memphis? You're from Durham? Well, come on in. I've known a lot of strange people from Durham, and you are welcome in my house." So stories and places are at the heart of the South. And race is the Achilles heel of the American South. When I was 5, I went to a 4-room schoolhouse where each teacher taught 2 grades. My black friends all went to a 1-room schoolhouse where one teacher taught 6 grades. And I knew in my heart that was wrong. And I've been bothered and obsessed by race, the murder of Emmett Till in Money, Mississippi, of Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida, of the black worshipers in Charleston, South Carolina, remind us that race is an open sore. And my work as a folklorist has been an attempt to build bridges across the troubled waters of race by focusing on stories and the people who tell those stories. So I want to carry you on the journey of that world, of the American South, and how Southerners deal with race. My first experience was growing up on a farm in Mississippi. And as a young child, a lady named Mary Gordon took me to a small black church on the farm called Rose Hill Church. And I learned the hymns. And I realized as I grew older that once the families were no longer there because there were no hymnals in the church, the music would disappear. So I began to record and photograph those worlds. And the families who were part of that church were descended from ancestors who first built the church as a brush arbor church from limbs of trees. As slaves, they worshiped there. The minister, Rev Isaac Thomas, would greet me when I came to the church, and he would say, "The doors of this church will always swing open on the hinges of welcome for you." I was welcomed by the families like the family of Amanda Gordon, who was the matriarch of a wonderful family, and she was one of those living libraries. She was the elder in the church who remembered the ancestral spirituals, the Dr. Watts hymns, and sang them from memory. I was also privileged to see Amanda Gordon's beautiful quilts, which she holds here with her grandchildren, a string quilt which evolved from the textiles of West Africa. I remember my friend Robert Appleton, who told me the stories of how his ancestors walked up the Natchez Trace as slaves from Natchez, Mississippi to the farm and stayed there for generations. His son, William Appleton, on the left, is an old friend. I call him every few weeks, and we talk about the memory of friends and family who are no longer alive, like Jesse Cooper, who was married by Reverend Thomas to Artemisia Cooper. And Amanda Gordon sang hymns at the wedding, and Jesse Cooper's grandmother was also a witness to the marriage. So my father was another anchor on that farm. He understood land, he loved equipment, and was a master at working the fields and making them more productive. He was also a courageous person who stood by his 5 children when we insisted on meeting with civil rights workers in Vicksburg during Freedom Summer. He sat across the table one evening from Robert Moses, the head of Freedom Summer. And Moses told my father, "This is the first time I've ever had a civil conversation with a white Mississippian." My brother Gray and I worked with Daddy in the summers in the fields with the men on the farm. Gray later became a state senator and was an advocate for health care and education for the state of Mississippi. My 3 sisters from the left, Shelby, Hester, and Martha, all became writers and artists. And my mother was the heart of our family. It was she who taught us the meaning of love and compassion. So that farm wrapped its arms around us in a powerful way and anchored us in its place and allowed me to go further as a folklorist and to capture friends in the neighborhood like Cecil Crosby, a master mechanic who could repair any piece of equipment. He loved to say that he could repair anything but a broken heart. Across the Big Black River was the Crossroads and the Crossroads store run by Aidan White, whose ancestors built that store 150 years earlier. Mrs. White told me how her father had been murdered in the store by a disgruntled customer. And when she and her mother took her father home, he looked at the wound in his side and said, what a small hole for your life to run out of. So I began to visit with neighbors like Mary Reagan, who lived in a home that her ancestors built, a home where General Grant stayed as he and his troops were moving toward the Battle of Vicksburg. I traveled further down the road to Utica, Mississippi, and spent time with a wonderful man, Jim Steed, who was a blacksmith who had shod thousands of hooves of horses and mules over his lifetime. I also began to look at the community, at the sense of color, the light, the beauty of the everyday life, what the French call la vie quotidienne. And I traveled up Highway 61 to Leland, Mississippi, and worked with a blues singer named James Thomas, who was also a gifted sculptor who would carve faces of people out of Mississippi clay, like this woman that he then painted and added a wig on the top of her head. Today, James Thomas's son, Pat Thomas, still plays the blues and does sculpture in memory of his father. The patriarch of the blues world in Leland was Shelby Papa Jazz Brown, who lived in a home on Kent's Alley in Leland, and every Saturday night, friends would gather, like Lee and Joe Cooper, to listen and dance to the blues, to eat sandwiches with corn liquor, and all ages would gather. Joe Cooper and younger people would come together in what I came to see as a blues family, related and joined by a shared love of the music. I also saw wonderful baskets that were made by Leon Peck Clark, who would cut a wonderful sapling of white oak and split it into splits and make baskets that he would sell. So on the porches of stores, of churches, of homes, there was always conversation and story being shared. There were also the roadside signs and people where I would stop, photograph, and talk with people whom I met. Everyone had a story to tell. Everyone taught me. People like Hickory Stick Victor Bob, who made walking canes out of hickory and would give them to friends. When a friend would say, "But I don't need a walking cane," he would say, "If you live long enough, you will." There was, of course, Otha Turner, who played fife and drum music, the African sounds from which blues were born. And today, sadly, Otha Turner is no longer alive, but his daughters keep the music alive and play it and affirm to us that the circle is indeed unbroken in his life. These are my teachers. These are the people who taught me the meaning of what the South is all about. I spent time in those worlds, those places, like Parchman Penitentiary, a 28,000-acre penal farm in the heart of the Mississippi Delta. And in the prison cells and in the fields, I interviewed the inmates and tried to understand what it was like to be black and in prison in the state of Mississippi. I also interviewed the prison warden, Sergeant Webb, to get a sense of what that world was all about. You never knew what you were going to see on the streets of places like Yazoo City, where I spent time with Pecolia Warner, whose Pea Quilt was a celebration of the first initial of her first name, Pecolia. And I asked Mrs. Warner, how did you first learn to put together such beautiful images and pieces of fabric? She responded, fireplace learning. At the side of her mother and grandmother, she learned to be a master quilter. On the walls of clubs and homes and inside, the artists are constantly working in these places. In places like Belzona, Mississippi, the California Club is decorated with musicians whose faces embody the sound of music there. There is also a sense of color that brings alive and animates the community. In the home of Harry Warren, Vicksburg, Mississippi, where I grew up, Mr. Warren does incredibly beautiful signage for restaurants to advertise their special foods of barbecue, ribs, and chicken. And in the Lizard Lounge in Belzona, there is color welcoming you into the lounge. And in Oxford, Mississippi, the visionary painter Theora Hamblett had a vision of her brother that appeared in a dream to her one night. And the next morning, she had a phone call telling her that her brother had died the night before. So she painted that vision as a way of remembering his presence. Memory is what it is all about. The memory trail of J.W. Garrison in Rossville, Tennessee, was literally a warehouse of objects from his past. So we are constantly feeling the presence of the past and the power of love and the intimacy of family in homes like Luster Willis and his wife Annie Mae Willis. Mr. Willis was a gifted artist who painted the faces of family and neighbors, and those paintings adorned their walls in their homes. He also sculpted from cedar wood walking canes with faces of family and friends on the top of the handle, and also his heroes like Reverend Martin Luther King. So places are animated worlds. They speak to us in the same way that people speak to us in the South. And in documenting with the camera, the tape recorder, and film these pieces and their places, we pledge to never forget the complicated and rich history of the American South. Thank you.